Hi, my name is Katie, and this is Yapping About History, a podcast where we yap about the past so that the present makes more sense. Welcome back to another episode, everyone. We're going to continue the Declaration of Independence and Revolutionary War theme, but this time we're going to be talking about the influential women of the time period. And sadly, I'm going to guess that you haven't heard of most of them. I know that I hadn't before doing some of this research. This is going to be part one of a two-part series on the women of the Revolution. This week, we're going to focus on the thinkers and writers of the time period, and next week, we'll be going over the women who fought in the war and were spies. So without further ado, let's get to yapping about the women thinkers and writers of the American Revolution. The first woman I wanted to talk about is a natural transition into the episode from last week because she was also someone who influenced Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Yep, and I think she is such a fascinating person, and her name is Catharine Macaulay, aka the Hater of Kings, and she was born in 1733 in England to a wealthy middle-class family. What I thought was so interesting about her was that she was a very well-known historian and radical political writer during her time. She was so famous during her lifetime that you could actually buy little statues of her. She was called the Incomparable Female Historian by James Burr in his Political Disquisitions in 1774. I mean, let's not forget, this was a time when women had little rights and they weren't seen as much more than property. And not only were many founding fathers fans of hers, but she also had regular correspondence with them, with John Adams, and she also wrote to his wife Abigail. She wrote to our pal B. Franks, Benjamin Rush, and other influential women that we'll be talking about a little bit later, like Mercy Otis Warren. Macaulay was and is most known for her 8-volume History of England, which covers the time period of the first Stuart kings, James I and his son Charles I. These are the two kings after Queen Elizabeth. She writes about how monarchies are inherently problematic and goes against the equal rights of man. But the first 4 volumes are what provided a blueprint for the American constitutional regicide. She writes this history in a way that defends what we now refer to as the regicide, and those were people in Parliament who agreed that the king had violated his constitutional duties and should be executed. At the time she's writing, the regicides are viewed as radical and dangerous. Macaulay turns this story into them striving for democratic government and sort of like a hero's journey for them. She ends the story with the execution of King Charles I, but frames it as a constitutional narrative about the people finally rising to power and getting rid of a tyrant. It's a story of how people can gain power again. She calls the people in Parliament who opposed the king patriots. At the end of her 4th volume, she reprints the warrant for the execution of the king, one that also shows the signatures. And this is probably the first time that it was actually printed for the public. And she also talks about those people who signed the warrant not as radicals working outside the law, but rather how they worked within the law and constitution. The American revolutionaries and founders looked to her work as a blueprint and justification for breaking ties with Britain. She showed that you could have a constitutional regicide, which meant removing the king by creating a constitutional republic. So not actually killing him, but just removing him via the Constitution. So let's talk a little bit more about good old Tommy Jefferson and his precious Declaration of Independence and compare it to Macaulay's work. He was a big fan of her work, and she was one of his preferred authorities. He bought her History of England for the University of Virginia Library and included her on his reading lists. If you read the last few pages of her 4th volume in the History of England and then the Declaration of Independence, you can see how Jefferson rearranges her ideas to fit his declaration. Some examples are: the Declaration says, "A prince whose character is thus marked by every act with which may define a tyrant." Macaulay writes, "In the suffering prince, we are apt to overlook the designing tyrant, and the king is a tyrannical, headstrong prince." Jefferson writes, "A design to reduce them under absolute despotism." Macaulay writes, "The wicked design to erect an unlimited and tyrannical government." Jefferson, "It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government." And Macaulay's, "It was a duty duty binding in conscience and in honor. Jefferson writes, we hold these truths to be self-evident, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Macaulay writes, principle obviously founded in truth, that the people under God are the origin of all just power. The Declaration, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station, and Macaulay writes, far from assuming superior or equal stations. And then there's also Julian Boyd's reconstruction of Jefferson's original rough draft that has the phrases advance from that subordination, which resembled Macaulay's sentence referencing subordinate inferiority. Jefferson writes, which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, and to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Macaulay writes, government was instituted for the protection of the people, for the end of securing, not overthrowing the rights of nature. The Declaration of Independence and the history of England also shared similar themes and arguments in relation to the themes of the duty of the people to overthrow corrupt governments, how just powers are derived, and the idea of separate and equal stations, and had the same theoretical structure and arguments. People often say that Thomas Jefferson took a lot from John Locke, but the four parts that people associate with the Declaration and Locke are the same four that Macaulay uses at the end of Volume 4. And she's not the first person to put these ideas together, but she is the first to use them to argue a legitimate severing of ties with a king. Also, the fact that she published the signed warrant for Charles I's execution probably inspired the members of the Continental Congress to sign the Declaration of Independence, because it was the same level of treason, but they understood that and wanted to put their names to it. They probably didn't think it was treason, and Macaulay frames the signers of the execution warrant as patriots. She creates an affordable version of her series and advertises to the sons and daughters of liberty. She argues that wanting a democratic republic is just as much for women as it is for men, and it requires women's participation. Macaulay goes to the U.S. in 1784, and the key revolutionaries are really excited to meet her. She even stays with George Washington at Mount Vernon for a week. She was also asked to write the history of the American Revolution, but she declines, and that's probably because she knew that her friend Mercy Otis Warren wanted to do that, and Macaulay wanted to kind of focus on writing about women's education and public education. Her importance and influence during her time was extraordinary, but why do we not really know her much in today's history? Well, during her time, she was kind of canceled for remarrying a 21-year-old guy when she was 47. This guy was William Graham, who was considered below her in social status, as well as being a bit younger than her. And he was brothers with this weird physician named James, who Macaulay was also friends with. So the people in her social circles were kind of like, ew. What are you doing? James ran a Temple of Health, which was London's first sex clinic. Some treatments included ice-cold champagne douches, electrical pulses, different types of aromas, and a 12 by 9 foot celestial bed that had caged turtle doves, and movement on the bed would set off music through organ pipes. It was the it place for the aristocracy, and it would cost you £50 to get treated. And although it was a popular place, it still got a lot of ridicule, so patients would often go to the temple wearing masks or veils to disguise their identity. Anywho, I just thought that was an interesting side story, but back to Catherine. Another reason she got canceled in her lifetime was that she unfortunately died right at the beginning stages of the French Revolution, and one of her last public writings was a very pro-revolutionary piece. And as the revolution played out, that opinion became less popular, and while other historians and political writers had the same initial reactions as Macaulay, they had the benefit of still being alive and getting to modify their stance as the revolution advanced, whereas Macaulay's stayed the same. So that's a bit unfair, but people judged her for that last work. But alas, most historians in more modern times have also downplayed her importance and influence, most likely for the simple fact that she was a woman. That is until historian Caroline Robbins wrote an essay in 1961 called Influence or Coincidence, and she asked whether the coincidence of thought revealed more significant influence, or did it rather suggest common circumstance, common classical authorities, a temper or fashion of thought. Could Macaulay, a woman, have influenced the revolution revolutionaries, or was Jefferson's similarity in the phrasing of the Declaration of Independence simply coincidence? With this article and research, Robbins played a critical role in recovering Macaulay. She believed Macaulay deserved, quote, more serious study than she normally provokes, end quote. She wrote the first modern article on Macaulay, published in 1949. This article argued that Macaulay belonged in the pantheon of British, American, and French liberty, and it included the material that would become the foundation of Macaulay scholarship. Robbins would go on to incorporate the article into a book called The 18th Century Commonwealthmen, connecting the histories of English struggles against tyranny in one century with those of American efforts for independence in another. Then, in 1963, another female American historian, Pauline Maier, identified Macaulay as a key link. She said Americans, quote, shared a characteristic Commonwealthman view of English history as expounded in the 1760s by Catharine Macaulay, end quote. These women historians were open to Macaulay's significance and believed a woman could have that much of an influence. And that's why having a diverse group of historians is so important in telling and researching history. But guess what? Male historians still downplayed or ignored Macaulay's influence even more recently, while still accepting Robbins and Maier's overall take on English history influencing the American effort for independence. So that makes a whole lot of sense. Like, in her time, you could literally buy statues of Macaulay. How can you say that she didn't have any influence? It's just ridiculous. Women still dominate Macaulay scholarship, and I want to shout out some of those women. In regards to Macaulay's importance in political theory, historian Karen Green has really led that charge. And with regards to British historical writing, we have Karen O'Brien and Devaney Lesser. The next person I want to talk about, I kind of already mentioned, and that is Mercy Otis Warren. She was actually friends with Catharine Macaulay, and they wrote to each other for 20 years. Warren was a published poet, political playwright, and satirist during the American Revolution and became the leading philosopher of the Revolution and the new U.S. She would come to be known as the conscience of the American Revolution. Mercy was born on September 14, 1728, the third of 13 children, to one of Massachusetts' most prominent wealthy families. Her grandfather was a leading merchant and tripled his family's assets over his lifetime. He was also a member of Massachusetts House of Reps and had been an agent for the New England Company. The household she grew up in and lived in until she got married had one enslaved Black person and several indentured Indian servants, all whose debt and labor maintained the fortunes of her family. Warren was educated alongside her brother, and she read very widely. She was encouraged to write creatively and quickly developed an interest in Republican theory and history. She married a man named James Warren, who was very politically active in 1754. James was elected to the Massachusetts legislature in 1766, and their home became a center of political discourse, especially for those opposed to British policies. Her husband became a paymaster general for the Continental Army when the war broke out, which is a pretty high command, and this gave her access to the political, military, and philosophical players of the American Revolution. This is when she started what would be a lifelong friendship with Abigail Adams. They wrote to each other often and would exchange books and offer each other mutual aid during the war. Warren began writing political dramas that denounced British policies and key officials in Massachusetts. Her work frequently centered women, especially in their roles to influence their male family members to patriotic action. She was a strong proponent of the idea of Republican motherhood. It's the idea that women should be active politically as mothers in order that their children can be good citizens of the new republic. She also wrote satires and several plays that roasted British colonial leaders, but published them all anonymously to avoid retaliation, but also to have her work taken seriously because she was a woman. After the war, she began to distance herself from John Adams and the Federalist view of government, thinking that it was too centralized. She wrote a piece called Observations on the New Constitution in 1788 under the name A Columbian Patriot, in which she denounced the Constitution. But through this work, she continued to demonstrate her beliefs that women should freely express ideas about politics and even governmental structures, a system in which she and other women would not be able to participate in as voters and office holders for over 100 years. My favorite quote from the pamphlet is, "America has, in many instances, resembled the conduct of a restless, vigorous, luxurious youth, prematurely emancipated from the authority of a parent, but without the experience necessary to direct him to act with dignity or discretion, which I feel like is still a fitting description of America almost 250 years later. In 1790, she publishes a book of her poems and plays under her own name for the first time, and she gets a lot of positive reviews, including some from Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. She is the third woman in the U.S. to publish a book of poems. Then in 1805, she publishes her history of the American Revolution called History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, which was the first nonfiction book published by a woman in the U.S. John Adams hated her history, and they had a public beef in the newspapers, and John Adams would bash her in his private letters as well. As I mentioned earlier, she was not a fan of the Federalists and the Constitution, which was the side of John Adams. She lived to be 86 years old and is buried in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Her work remains an important primary source for understanding the political and philosophical driving forces of the American Revolution. Warren provided a key perspective on women's roles within a political discourse of that time period and centered women in her narratives, and also encouraged them to be political actors within their families and through their pens for the betterment of the new nation. I'll end this section on Mercy Otis Warren with part of a letter she wrote to Catharine Macaulay in December of 1774, a little bit before the war breaks out, because I feel like it so poignantly describes both their situations and can even be applied to women professionals today. The quote is, "You see, madam, I disregard the opinion that women make but indifferent politicians. When the observations are just and due honor to the heart and character, I think it very immaterial whether they flow from a female lip in the soft whispers of private friendship, or whether thundered in the Senate in the bolder language of the other sex." The next woman I want to talk about is named Phillis Wheatley. You know how I said that Warren was the third woman to write a book of poetry? Well, Phillis Wheatley was the second woman to do so and the first African-American woman to do it. Phillis was born around 1753 in Western Africa. Unfortunately, we do not know much about the first 8 years of her life living in Africa, but she was kidnapped and trafficked into slavery in 1761 and was sold to a man named John Wheatley in Boston, Massachusetts. We also don't know what her birth name was, but she was renamed Phillis by her enslaver after the slave ship that she arrived on. She became Mrs. Susanna Wheatley's domestic servant and companion. Although she did not speak English when first arriving to the American colonies, within 16 months of lessons from the Wheatley's daughter, Mary, she was taught English, Latin, history, geography, religion, and the Bible specifically. She also learned how to write. This was a very rare education for an enslaved person, and probably even rare for a woman in general during this time. She began to write poetry when she was a young teenager. She wrote about a story she overheard from one of the Wheatley's dinner guests who described a narrow escape from being shipwrecked. This poem was published in 1767 in the Newport Mercury, a weekly newspaper in Rhode Island. The foreword of the poem, likely written by John Wheatley, says that she heard the story while tending the table and was inspired to write the verse. And it seemed to play up how crazy it was that an enslaved person could write such an amazing poem. Ironically, but it seems to be par for the course during this time in the American colonies, the same newspaper also ran advertisements for slave markets and rewards for the capture of enslaved people that had self-emancipated. Her poem a few years later in 1770 called An Egalic Poem on the Death of the Celebrated Divine George Whitefield, who was a famous English preacher, made her a household name. And as she got older, she would focus her writings on connecting her desire for freedom from enslavement with the ideals of freedom within the Revolution. She was even famous across the pond, and she was sponsored by the English Countess of Huntingdon to come over to London to publish her first collection of poems. She was accompanied by John Wheatley's son, because remember, she was still enslaved. And that's such a weird dichotomy, to be so famous and be a published poet, both in the American colonies and in England, but still enslaved. The published book of poems had a portrait of Phillis in it to prove that her work was really done by a Black woman. It also had a foreword that was signed by John Hancock, was also signed by other Boston notables. The portrait was likely drawn by an enslaved artist named Scipio Moorhead in Boston, who knew Wheatley personally and to whom she dedicated the poem To S.M., a young African painter, on seeing his works. It is the first frontispiece, which depicts a woman writer in America and possibly the first portrait of an American woman while writing. The journey of her poetry books from London to the American colonies coincidentally lines up with a very infamous or famous moment in U.S. history. Boxes of her books set sail on a ship called the Dartmouth in 1773. Can you guess where this is going? The Dartmouth landed in Boston in November of 1773, and not only was it carrying Phillis's poetry, but it was also carrying 114 chests of tea. The ship was impounded at the wharf until the citizens could decide its fate. And then on the night of December 16th, they decided to throw that tea, along with tea from 2 other ships, into the Boston harbor. Luckily for Phillis, this was a strategic strike, and her crates of books were left unharmed, and she was able to start selling them in January of 1774. But then while Wheatley was in England, she experienced new ideas of freedom because the year before, in 1772, the English court had ruled that enslavement was not supported by any valid English statute. This meant that any enslaved person in England should be considered legally free. Her writings were popular with abolitionists, particularly those in England and France, and they used her book as proof that Black people were just as intelligent as white people and should not be enslaved. When she returned to the U.S. in 1774, she likely negotiated for her freedom with John Wheatley, leveraging her fame, and there was also probably pressure from her English fans, and she could have even brought up the possibility of suing for her freedom from England due to that previous English court ruling. But whatever negotiating tactics she used, they worked, and she became a free person. In 1775, she wrote one of her most famous poems, the one that she dedicated to George Washington, called "To His Excellency General George Washington," after he was appointed to the role of Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. In the poem, she described North America as Columbia. Again, this is a woman guiding people to justice, prosperity, and community, named after Christopher Columbus, and this is the first notable use of this personification. Overall, the poem was praising Washington and describing the war effort as a provocation of Providence. Washington wrote about this poem to a friend saying, quote, "With the view of doing justice to her great poetical genius, I had a great mind to publish the poem, but not knowing whether it might not be considered rather as a mark of my own vanity than as a compliment to her, I laid it aside till I came across it again in the manner just mentioned," end quote. The friend has the poem published instead to avoid any embarrassment to Washington, and the friend, Colonel Joseph Reed, wrote an intro to the poem saying, quote, "The following letter and verses were written by the famous Phillis Wheatley, the African poetess, and presented to His Excellency General Washington," end quote. The month before it was published, Washington wrote to Wheatley personally, kind of saying the same thing, saying that he wanted to publish the poem, but he didn't want it to look bad on him, and called her a very impressive poet. Although her book of poems had already been published by this point, there's no specific mention of her race in her poem or letter to Washington, so I'm not really sure if he knew who she was, if she was Black, but it seems like a very odd response if he had known her race. Washington enslaved many African people and actively pursued runaway slaves, and obviously didn't think very highly of Black people in general, so I don't know. It's kind of a weird response. I tried to look it up to see if Washington had known that she was a Black woman when he first received her poem, but I couldn't find a definitive answer. But my guess is that he probably didn't know, but then again, the founding fathers had a tendency to have wildly hypocritical views when it came to race and enslavement, so who knows. After the war, Wheatley had plans for a second book of poems and began working on the proposals for it and writing the poems, but it never panned out because she could not find financial support, and these manuscripts have never been found. She married a free Black man named John Peters, and the couple had 3 children, 2 of whom may have died in infancy. John could not hold a steady job, and his multiple business ventures failed, which put the family in a dire financial situation. Phillis had given him all she had from the sale of her book, but that was not enough, and he was eventually imprisoned for debt. The Phillis Wheatley Historical Society notes that, quote, "It is ironic that as a slave, Phillis had the freedom and support to be creative, but as a free married woman, she had none of it," end quote. Sadly, Phillis's story gets worse, and she was pregnant when her husband abandoned her, and she lived the rest of her life in poverty poverty. She stopped writing, which was the only way she had known how to make money before, in order to find more steady work to support herself and her soon-to-be-born child. She found work at a boarding house, but she was not used to the manual labor, and I'm sure the conditions within that boarding house were not great because she quickly becomes ill. She developed pneumonia, and on December 5th, 1784, the day after giving birth to her daughter, Phillis died alone and poor, with her daughter dying the same day. She was only 31 years old. Their burial place is unknown. Some think that they were buried in an unmarked grave at the Granary burying ground where John Wheatley was buried, but others think that she was buried in Copp's Hill burying ground. And the last woman I wanted to talk about, but certainly not least, is a woman whose name also appears on the Declaration of Independence. And I bet you didn't know there was a woman on that, now did you? Her name was Mary Katharine Goddard, and her name appears at the bottom of the first printed copies of the Declaration of Independence that include the signatures of all the signers. Now, you may have noticed, because you are a perceptive listener, that I didn't say that there was a woman's signature on the Declaration of Independence. And for that, I'd say, good catch. She wasn't a signer, but actually the person who ran the print shop that printed these copies. She was running her brother's printing and publishing shops in Baltimore, Maryland in 1777 when this all went down. Her brother was always looking for the next business opportunity, so he left his sister in charge. So even though he owned the shops, Mary was the one who was doing all of the work, and she started making a name for herself in this world. She was even printing the Maryland Journal under the name M.K. Goddard, replacing her brother's name. Nice. Not only was she running these shops, she was also named Baltimore's postmaster in July of 1775, making her the first postmaster ever there and the first female postmaster of the colonies. She would later go on to be the first female postmaster in the U.S. But going back to the Declaration of Independence, in December of 1776, the Continental Congress fled to Baltimore because the British had taken over their original meeting place in Philadelphia, and they just happened to set up shop a few blocks away from Mary's printing, office, bookstore, and post office. She was a proud supporter of the Patriot cause, and along with the Declaration of Independence, she also printed their congressional resolutions and notices. And remember, things weren't going very well for the American forces during this time, so it was still risky putting your name on the Declaration of Independence and printing it with all the signatories on it. If the Americans ever lost the war, signing that document would be signing your own death warrant. So I think it's a pretty badass move on Mary's part to be like, yeah, and tell them who printed these documents too. I ain't scared, bitch. And I mean, she was probably thinking something similar to that. But when the war was over, her brother came back and was like, thanks so much for making all of my businesses so successful. You can now run along. And Mary was like, I don't think so. I'm doing a pretty good job of this, motherfucker, so I'm not leaving. And this kind of forms a bit of a sibling rivalry. But with the passage of the U.S. Constitution, Postmaster General Samuel Osgood removed her from her position as postmaster with, what else? A misogynistic excuse that a woman would not be able to handle all the traveling that would be required for the job. Meanwhile, she had already been doing it for several years. Mary appealed straight to President George Washington, reminding him of how she had held it down as postmaster during the fucking war, saying it was at her own risk and advanced hard money to defray the charges of postwriters for many years when they were not to be procured on any other terms, end quote. She then challenged the claim that she would be unequal to the job requirements, saying, quote, as two persons must be employed, according to this new plan, she is more adequate to give instructions to the writing postmasters how to act than any other person possibly could, end quote. Washington responded, telling her that he would not interfere in political appointments. She also got 200 prominent citizens of Baltimore as witnesses and then used that to petition the U.S. Senate, also to no avail, which I feel like is a common pattern in U.S. history of women getting shit done in times of war. But as soon as it's over, the men want everything back to normal and take away any sort of autonomy or power or freedom that the women may have gained during wartime. However, she did continue to own the book-selling business. She died in 1816, and in her will, she freed her enslaved servant, Belinda Starling, and left her entire estate to Belinda. So, I mean, I guess that's like a positive. And that's all I have for you about the influential women writers and thinkers of the American Revolution. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Yapping About History, and stay tuned for next week, where we'll be talking about the women fighters and spies of the Revolution. I hope this episode is a reminder that what we do today will shape the stories that are told tomorrow. History isn't just something we remember, it's something we carry with us. Bye!